Well, Russia absolutely started the war, just in case there was any doubt there. You got to look at the Russian space. The territory that they live in from Central Europe out into Siberia is some of the world's worst farmland. You can grow one crop of short season wheat and that's about it. So the Russians have never been able to have a national road network. They've never had the money. Everything has to be moved by rail. And so their forces move very, very slowly. They have to literally walk places. And if you look at the area around where they live, there are a lot of open territories that are useless. They're near desert, they're near Arctic. And then beyond that are some actual barriers, places where there are deserts or seas or mountains. So the Russian strategy going back over 3 centuries has been to advance out of their kind of crappy land, through the really crappy land on their shoulders, and then get to those geographic barriers where you can't run a panzer division through it. And then they forward position those very, very slow-moving troops on the access points between those barriers. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they're not in those barriers, but they're on the way to 2 of them. So from the Russian point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is like phase 5 of an 8-part plan. The Russians have done this multiple times in other countries in the former Soviet world since 1992. And if they succeed in Ukraine, they will push on. And the next line of countries that would allow them to actually control those access points include Romania and Poland, both of which are NATO countries. The Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians. And they have a lot more men to lose, and they have a lot higher tolerance for casualties. So the 2 or 3 to 1 ratio that the Ukrainians have been inflicting on the Russians in terms of casualty ratios is wildly insufficient if the Ukrainians are going to win. They need to achieve a series of mass fatality events that kills at least minimum 500,000 Russian troops in a very short period of time. That is very difficult to do. They also, because of the numbers disconnect, can only win if they win on quality and, above all, mobility. And they haven't been able to do that this winter because it has been freakishly warm in Ukraine all winter. The ground never froze solid. It's still about 40 degrees today. And that means that all of the fields are not frozen solid. They're mud. The Ukrainians can't maneuver in the mud, so they can't use their superior mobility in order to encircle, cut off, and dice up the Russian troops. This is buying the Russians time to reinforce. They've started a second, what's the word I'm looking for here, mobilization. And by the time we get to May 1, which will be spring and mud season will be over, the Ukrainians will have more troops with more training and better equipment, but the Russians will have thrown an extra 500,000 men into the fight. So we're going to find out very, very soon, certainly before the end of June, which of these battle strategies is going to be more effective. And the numbers absolutely favor the Russians. Because remember, unless the Ukrainians can inflict 8 to 1 casualty ratios, they still lose. But if they can pull that off and completely break Russian military power, then it's game on. We will know by mid-June just who's going to win this war. Now, Step 2, the impact that this has on all those economic issues you were bringing up. The Russians are a major producer or processor of any number of industrial and agricultural materials that just don't have good substitutes anywhere. On the agricultural front, potash is the most important one. In terms of industry, I'd say chromium and nickel are probably near the top because you can't make steel without them. All of this stuff has been maintained, all this infrastructure has been maintained not by the Russians, but by Westerners who are no longer there. A lot of the industrial infrastructure dates back to the 60s, and we are already seeing industrial accidents that are so big that they can't be seen from orbit. They can be detected from orbit because the explosions are so big. It's happening in energy and natural gas. It's happening in agricultural production. It's happening in chemicals. So whether it happens in 3 months or 3 years, we need to count on most of the industrial materials that the Russians send to the rest of the world going away, regardless of who wins this war. And that makes a lot of things very difficult for a lot of other players.
Because the global boycott, if you will, the sanctions will maintain in perpetuity regardless of who wins this war?
I think that's safe, but the Russians are losing the ability to produce it anyway. So even if you're willing to go around the sanctions, and a lot of these products like, say, nickel or potash, they're not under sanction. It's just people refusing to use them. And now they're going away. Fertilizer output from the Russian space is already down by 20 to 40%, which depending on which nutrient you're looking at. This is something the world is not ready for. If we really are going to reindustrialize the United States, we need a lot of steel. If we are really going to electrify everything, we need 4 times as much nickel and 10 times as much lithium. We can't do that Normally. We've never, as a species, been able to double the volume of any material that we were already had in use within a decade, and we have to do it for 14 things for the Green Everything program, and we're going to now do it without the Russians. So we are looking at significant corporate breaks in terms of the supply for a lot of basic materials. The ones I'm most concerned about by far are those fertilizer materials. We were very lucky in 2022. Farmers the world over had great weather, and everyone had a backup fertilizer supply in their back pocket. That's gone. And Mother Nature is never that nice 2 years in a row. So this is probably the beginning of a significant year of food shortages on top of the industrial shortages. You remember that first week of the war when that giant convoy was moving south from Belarus to Kiev, and we thought it was all over on like day 2. And then on day 4, it stopped because they forgot fuel. And on day 7, all the soldiers walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. Everyone I know in NATO kind of came to the same conclusion that the Russians don't know how to fight. It's not that they've forgotten the lessons of the Soviet period. It's they've forgotten the lessons of the Tsar. They're almost starting from scratch. And if you put NATO up against the Russians directly, you're going to get 1,000 to 1 casualty ratios. And that made no one happy, because if the Russians can win in Ukraine, we know they're coming for Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Romania, and those are NATO countries. If Ukraine loses and we get that head-to-head Russian-NATO fight, we know we will wipe the floor with them. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential existence, and they will use every card they have.
The Russians see that, or Putin sees that?
The Russians. There have not been protests in Russia, not just because the propaganda has dug into the Russians.
He has more support than the West thinks he does.
A lot more. There's not a challenge to him from within. And if you think back to the first mobilization, 1 million men fled the country. There were no protests. The Russians are broadly in favor of the war. They would just prefer not to fight in it.
It is the 13th of February, and the news over the weekend is that the Russians have announced a near imminent plan to cut 500,000 barrels a day of oil production, which comes out to about 0.5% of global production and roughly 10% of Russian exports. Now, for those of you who have been watching me for a while, you know that I'm really concerned about the stability of Russian production, not just because of the war, but because of their geology. Most oil production comes from the permafrost. And if there's a situation where the crude can't flow, whether because people aren't taking the crude away at their export points or because they shut it in themselves, the crude in the wellhead freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice, and it pops the wells from the inside. And repairing that damage the last time around took 30 years. And last time, most of the oil services firms were part of the process. This time, they're gone. So if we do lose Russian oil production for any reason, it's not just gone, it's gone for a very, very, very long time, and that is not priced into the market at all. Now, the 500,000 is probably not a problem. The Russians have about 1 million barrels per day from their western fields that are not in the permafrost. And so they can shut those in and bring that back on and shut it in again and bring it back online. In fact, they did this in the early weeks of the war last time when people weren't taking their crude. Well, now we have a couple more things in play. The European oil ban is in place. The European refined products ban is in place. It's not technically illegal to buy or ship these products, but you have to do it without European insurance or vessels if it's under a certain price point. And that is reducing demand for Russian product around the world because they're having a hard time getting this stuff out. Also, the break-even price for a lot of Russian crude is between $40 and $60 a barrel. And now that the prices that the Russians can charge are under that threshold, the Russians don't have an economic incentive to pump the stuff in many cases. So 500,000 is taking away half of the buffer. We're not to the point where we're going to see permanent shut-ins, but we are not all that far away.